Hey, you guys. Today's episode is brought to you by Amazon Crossing, publisher of The Ardent Swarm, a new novel by Yamen Manai, an award-winning novel about bees, about a North African country in the wake of the Arab Spring. It's about a beekeeper. It's about a lot of things. It's a brilliantly accessible modern-day parable in which Yamen Manai uses a masterful blend of humor and drama to reveal what happens to a country shaken by revolutionary change after the world stops watching. The Ardent Swarm, available now from Amazon Crossing. Hey, where is this? All right. How you doing? Welcome to the Otherppl show. I'm Brad Listi. It's nice to be with you wherever you happen to be. I have a great show for you. I have, as my guest, for the second time, Hari Kunzru. He is celebrating the publication of a new novel, or at least the recent publication of a new novel. It is called Red Pill, and it is available from Knopf. Hari Kunzru first guested on this program almost 9 years ago to the day, in episode 57, all the way back in 2012. He's published 5 previous novels: White Tears, Gods Without Men, My Revolutions, Transmission, and The Impressionist, and now Red Pill. And this is a book that has worked on me in a strange way. I was trying to explain this to Hari. I'm not sure if I did a good enough job of it. But it's one of these books that kind of hit me upside the head. And the best comparison that I can make is when you listen to a record or an album, at least back when people used to do that, when you sat and you listened to an entire record, and afterwards, you weren't sure exactly how you felt, and yet you couldn't stop thinking about it, and then you wanted to listen to it again. And then over time, your appreciation for it deepens, and you start to realize all the different things that it's doing, and it just takes you a little while to catch up to it. That's kind of how I feel about Red Pill. It's a very deeply intelligent, ominous, unexpected, gripping, dryly funny book. I could go on with all these descriptors, but it's just a book that gave me a unique experience that I really enjoyed. And I was trying to explain this to Hari, but the problem was that I was kind of in the throes of the immediate aftermath. I had just finished it, and then suddenly I was talking to him, and I felt discombobulated. And that's to his credit. He discombobulated me with his novel. So I really enjoyed the book, and I was grateful for the opportunity to talk with him, and I think we should just get to it. So here is my conversation with Hari Kunzru. His latest novel, Red Pill, is out there now from Knopf.
Well, originally it's a reference to a film called The Matrix, a very famous science fiction film where the lead, Keanu Reeves, is offered a choice. He's offered the choice of the blue pill or the red pill. If he takes the blue pill, the world as he experiences it will remain the same, and he'll carry on just as if nothing had happened. But if he takes the red pill, he will see the world as it is, and that's what he opts to do in the movie. And the revelation is that there's this appalling dystopia in which human beings are kind of plugged into some sort of alien machine. So it became a shorthand for a kind of revelation, and after a while it got adopted. Weirdly, it first got adopted by pickup artists, these guys who kind of believe that, you know, they can teach each other techniques for how to sleep with women, and they started referring to being red-pilled as understanding that there were these kind of surefire techniques that they thought they could use to do that. But from that usage, it's gradually migrated into much wider usage. It's generally these days associated with the alt-right, and as a word for suddenly the revelation that the world as it's described by, I suppose, mainstream liberalism isn't true, and that their world picture, often very conspiratorial and very kind of brutal in some ways, is actually the truth. I mean, for example, you see on right-wing forums, far-right forums, people asking each other, "Are you red-pilled on the JQ?" And the JQ is the Jewish question. So what they're asking is, do you believe in their anti-Semitic conspiracy theory? And it's a kind of rather sort of self-serving way of seeing things. I mean, the idea that you have the truth and that the normies, the mainstream people are, they're half asleep, they're sheeple, not, they don't understand the world as it is. And so, my use of it for the title is slightly ironic, I suppose, in that it is about this narrator who is a sort of liberal intellectual from Brooklyn, and his encounter with a figure of the alt-right, and more generally with the idea that some of his preconceptions about the world might be wrong.
And in terms of the alt-right and its online existence, like 4chan, 8chan, these forums online where a lot of the community is formed, the virtual community is formed among these people. I have to confess, I have very little understanding of all this. Your book, I think, kind of hints at it. You don't have, 4chan doesn't factor into the narrative, but you could imagine how it might, like peripherally. And I'm curious to know how much research into like alt-right ideology you did, to understand the underpinnings of a good part of your book.
Well, weirdly, I mean, I've always had. One of the ever since I got on the internet quite early, I suppose, relatively speaking. I've been online since the early '90s, and even in that kind of period, there was already a far right presence on the net. And one of the interests I had in the early days was kind of keeping in touch with subcultures which I wasn't a part of, or people who are very, very distant from me. And so I sort of developed a kind of slightly weird self-hating hobby, I suppose you'd call it, of occasionally of just hanging out on some of these far-right sites just to see what it was, how they talk to each other, how their ideas were formed. And so, I mean, this was the sort of thing that I used to do occasionally in downtime, to sort of go on sites like Stormfront and see these, see what the Nazis are talking about today. And then sometime in the early 2000s, a leftist activist friend of mine sent me some screenshots from 4chan, which I'd never heard of at the time. And it was of something called a raid that they had done there. At the time, there was a kind of, I suppose you'd call it a little virtual world that was aimed at young people, children, teenagers, called Habbo Hotel. And the denizens of 4chan had decided it would be good fun to all kind of make avatars and go into this world and just start sort of causing problems. And so they'd made these very sort of stereotypical black avatars with afros. They always looked a bit like sort of Samuel Jackson in that Tarantino movie. And they had stood in a swastika shape in such a way that it blocked the exit to a particular room. And so there were all these kind of trapped kids. And every time anyone asked, could you get out of the way, they would say various sort of obscene and racist things. And my friend was very freaked out by this. He thought this was a sort of vector for young far-right organizing. And I wasn't so sure. So I went on 4chan, and I had a period of spending, not posting there, but just looking at it. I mean, in a kind of like a pulled car crash kind of way, feeling like the guy at the end of Clockwork Orange, with my eyes sort of wide open, because there's this kind of arms race of disgustingness that they're engaged in. There's this kind of gross out humor, but it was a sort of competition to see who could say or assert the most extreme and outrageous things. And a lot of it was sort of flirting with illegality as well. And I was online at one point when somebody posted a picture of a pipe bomb and said that they were about to go to their school and plant this bomb. And the reactions were extraordinary to me. The reactions weren't like, my God, don't do this. They were like, that doesn't look like it would work. Look, what are you doing? That technically you should be able to make a better pipe bomb than that. And there was, and the sort of, the pose was very much like nothing will shock us. It's the real teenage boy pose of, I'm so tough that I can deal with anything. And as it turned out, this guy had firstly constructed his pipe bomb out of a plastic pipe, so it wouldn't have worked. But secondly, somebody had gone to the police with it, so he was arrested before he did anything else.
I was going to say, I mean, like at some point when you're observing this, do you feel a sense of responsibility? Like, oh my, do I need to alert somebody?
I mean, as it turned out, I was on after the fact. I mean, one of the things with 4chan is, and that whole model, there are many sites like that now, is it's not archived. And it's kind of like this constant froth. If people like something or they're interested in it, it kind of bubbles up to the top and is easy to see. If you post something and nobody's interesting, it just kind of falls to the bottom and then vanishes, and there's no record of it. There's no log. So that's another reason why people can say very extreme things. And also the culture is that nobody posts under their real name, and to the extent that they all term themselves anons or anonymous. I mean, you probably heard the phrase, anonymous, because at certain point slightly later on, they all got involved in a big battle with the Church of Scientology, and which is a whole other story. But at this point in the early aughts, when I was looking at it, it seemed to be largely teenage white boys in the US, and there was a sort of flirting with extreme misogyny and racism. And what's happened in the intervening time is that the heavy dose of irony that I felt that a lot of people were posting with got stripped away. And I mean, one thing that happened actually is that they did raid some genuine committed political white nationalist sites, and then piqued the interest of white nationalists who realised that they were ripe for being organised and being converted. So a much more serious and focused kind of extremism began to grow up on the site about a decade later. I mean, at the time, I thought what I was seeing was just sort of edgelord nonsense of the kind that is in a lot of places in the internet, particularly extreme, but I didn't take it seriously in a political way. And so when it pops up in 2015-ish as a site for organizing the kind of wiggier end of the sort of pro-Trump world, it was a surprise to me how a lot of it seemed like the kids had grown up and they got much more vicious, and a lot of the attitudes were serious now, and that's what we've seen. I mean, I never ever would have predicted that it would have such a sort of impact outside its tiny milieu. I mean, there's a longer story to tell. Like, as I said, in the intermediate period, there was a period where they went on a kind of crusade against Scientology, because about the only thing that 4chan and the Chan culture agrees with itself about is that information wants to be free on the internet, and Scientology's practice of secrecy and its copywriting of its teachings and so on was a sort of a red flag, a red rag to a bull to them. And so they went, but around about 2010, 2011, they had this kind of quite amusing fight with the Scientologists. But then they became a very sort of serious site for radicalizing people into the far right. I mean, they aren't the only place. There is a various Reddit forums, and more recently, since there's been a kind of crackdown, all that sort of stuff has moved on to Telegram and other kind of more, and Discord servers and very sort of much more private spaces. But at the time, it was a space that somebody like me could just sort of wander into and see this process taking place. And I became more and more sort of disturbed by it in the more sort of recent years, and had been kind of keeping tabs on it. And as it became a sort of force in real world politics, I realized that it was so sort of out of the experience of a lot of people who are used to, they're used to the usual political forums. They're used to the sort of public speech and the kind of ways that people behave in a much more traditional political conversation. And so this arrival of Pepe the Frog and his 4chan allies really blindsided people. But I'd been kind of aware of it actually for years and years, and like a lot of people, I hadn't taken it as seriously as I perhaps ought to have done.
Well, okay, yeah, and I think too, there's like a chicken or egg question that occurs to me as I think about all this stuff, because you have a character in your novel named Anton, who is a kind of a I guess you would call him an elite figure of the alt-right, or, somebody who has like cultural cachet and money and certain ideological stances that congeal pretty well with the environment you just described. And I think of it in a, in the political realm, in the environment that we've been living in, especially for the past few years. And I wonder about the existence of these communities online, these teenage boys, who kind of grew up and got meaner and more literal. And I think about figures like Steve Bannon, who I feel like Anton, the character in your book, to me, he feels kind of like an echo of somebody like Bannon. And I'm thinking to myself, like, is somebody, the puppeteer, is somebody manipulating this, or is it a situation where it grows organically? And then they're just exploiting what's already there. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Absolutely, and I think the answer inevitably is both. There's an organic movement there for people to exploit, but it's in various people's interests to have that grow because it's disruptive. I mean, without and you don't really have to get terribly conspiratorial about it to see that people put money into this. People put time and effort and resources into it. There are people like Bannon. I mean, Bannon's trying to put together his strange kind of crusader training school in Italy right now. I mean, I just heard the Italian government has withdrawn his permission to use this old monastery, but he's clearly a person who has access to serious sources of money. We're familiar with I'm sort of blanking on her name. The woman who has funded a lot of
Rebecca Mercer.
Yeah, so yeah, that's right. Rebecca Mercer has put money into Parler and Breitbart and various other forums of this kind, and there are donations that are given to prominent figures who are essentially figures of the Chans, and so I would say that clearly anybody who has an interest in sort of disrupting, let's say, the liberal consensus would have a reason to kind of promote these people, even if they don't actually necessarily agree with all the positions, just on the grounds that disruption creates opportunity. I also noticed that there's a very, very strong interest in this kind of politics and this kind of worldview from quite elite figures in the tech world. Peter Thiel is sort of well known for his libertarian politics and his support of more fairly far to the right, but still quite kind of mainstream figures. But just in kind of cultural terms, you notice people like Palmer Luckey or Elon Musk, very rich guys who can afford to sort of drop a little money in the direction of these kind of people. I mean, Musk is certainly somebody who tweets memes and is kind of he's plugged into this culture. I'm not in any way sort of suggesting that he's a white nationalist or has any particular political beliefs, but a lot of it's this sort of osmosis into the cultural conversation through humor, through memes, through little cultural sort of nods and winks. And
I should interrupt. Like, Elon Musk tweeted about taking the red pill. Like, not that is defining, because anybody could make that joke, I guess, if you're making a Matrix reference. But it does at least give you pause.
And it was so interesting, like, who responded. I mean, Ivanka Trump, kind of endlessly annoying. Immediately like taken.
Yeah.
And all sorts of people responded to that. And these days when you say take the red pill, again, it's not necessarily a kind of straightforward assertion of a particular set of far right beliefs, but it's certainly an assertion that you believe that the liberal consensus about how the world is, or the presentation of the world through mainstream media, is fake or incorrect, and de facto that leads to a lot of other things. The world of Q is unthinkable without the prior world of the Chans as a kind of incubator for it.
And I don't think mainstream American, particularly mainstream American culture, has quite wrapped its head around this. And the narrator that you're presenting in your novel is, I guess, some kind of proxy of you. Especially now that I know that you were on 4chan in the early aughts. That's kind of the picture that you're painting of your narrator, is somebody who's got kind of a good antenna and is receiving all of these signals, and trying to put the puzzle pieces all together, and to make sense of it is no easy feat, in the digital and media environment that we live in.
What I wanted to do with the book was to just to give a sense of a sort of slide, or a sense that my experience of the last few years has been of wondering how far things were going to go, and trying to kind of calibrate the sense that there was a very sort of profound shift going on. And I have to say, I don't think that shift has been ended by the dismissal of Trump. I think it's a larger thing, and I think it's in a way, what we're living through is the internet as a sort of acid or solvent eating away at the norms of the pre-internet age. But the novel sort of starts off as if it's going to be a kind of campus comedy. This guy is offered a prestigious residency in Germany, and there are some colourful and annoying characters that he's with, and so that's a sort of it's almost a sort of genre. It's a very sort of familiar idea, the grumpy intellectual who's going to spar with his peers, and then it slides away from that, as you say, into a kind of examination of his state of mind as he gets more and more untethered from reality. And he has a breakdown, and the book is explicit that this is a sort of psychotic break that he has. But the question that interests me is, in a sense, is that the rational reaction to now? Is this feeling of panic and horror and a sense of being unmoored and not having your bearings anymore? Isn't that actually in some ways the correct reaction to have in these times, to be scrambling for, to understand that the terms and conditions which you were, understanding things by, are no longer functioning? And there is this sort of, at the centre there, the narrator sort of perceives that he's in a kind of agonistic battle with this guy Anton, who's as you say is he's a guy with a lot of cultural capital, who seems to be surreptitiously using his position as the showrunner of a popular cop show to sort of seed certain sorts of sort of nihilistic rightish ideas into the culture. And Anton, he's not exactly Bannon. He's a kind of younger, a sort of hipper character than Bannon, but he's a composite of all sorts of figures from that world. And one of the ideas that interests me particularly about the actual serious kind of far right people is that they have a very calibrated understanding of how they need to function in the world, in the worlds that they move in. If, for example, you are in LA, you're working in TV, you can't wear your white nationalism on your sleeve. You have to be under the radar in some way. So there's this phrase about hiding your power level, and you find conversations going on online about when you reveal your power level to people. So you'll do these kind of Masonic hints to those in the know, and you might which will allow you to sort of scout out people who actually think like you. But as far as people who aren't in the know are concerned, you're not saying anything outrageous or overtly anti-Semitic or whatever it would be. And so the idea of a character who has this access to people, through the medium of television and drama, such a sort of popular form, but is also on the down low quite involved in organizing and has a sort of political agenda, was a fascinating one to me, in a slightly paranoid way. I mean, it's a paranoid book. And
but yeah, it is. But it's also. I mean, I made the Bannon comparison. It's like a cooler Bannon, would maybe be the better way to put it. But Bannon, he owns part of Seinfeld. Like, he had Hollywood aspirations, and he's dabbled out here.
There's some terrible Bannon scripts in existence, and
right.
And I mean, there was also that amazing kind of involvement that he had with the kind of, what was it called? There was a sort of biosphere. That's it, the biosphere project back in the 80s and early 90s, where they were trying to kind of work out how to, whether you could make a self-sustaining biosphere, artificial biosphere for colonizing Mars. He ends up in the middle of that, which is, he's always had a utopian streak, Bannon. I mean, that's one of the interesting thing about him, is that he's not just your standard issue Republican Party cynic with a set of unpleasant beliefs about his own superiority. The man is a utopian, and the man has that kind of vision of absolute transformation that is it's extremely destructive and a very sort of violent vision. But he's not pragmatic in the way that the standard issue sort of Republican who's looking for tax cuts and judges is.
No, he wants to dismantle the whole system. I mean, as far as I understand it, and I think that brings me to a question, like a logical question about Bannon and about Rebecca Mercer, and about anybody in a position of leadership, politically, culturally, or otherwise, in that part of the right wing. What is their end game? What does Rebecca Mercer want? Why is she doing this? What does Steve Bannon? Steve Bannon wants to create what, like a white supremacist, white nationalist government, like that's libertarian and stripped down of all social safety net? Like, what is it?
Yeah, I mean, Rebecca Mercer is really quite a mystery to me, as is her father. I mean, Bannon certainly seems to have a sort of nativist angle, doesn't he? I mean, he wants, and he seems to believe in this clash of civilizations idea. There's the values of the West, which he, in the broadest possible terms, imagines as a sort of Enlightenment, rationalism, and the scientific method, and I don't know, Adam Smith or whatever else it would be. Against the benighted brown hordes. Infamously, he recommended everybody read a novel called Camp of the Saints, this French novel from the 1970s that is about a kind of overwhelming tide of immigration, this kind of brown tide of humanity led by a sort of fakir figure. And that culminates in the heroic white defenders machine gunning these as they literally sort of come up the beach. It's this kind of D-Day type, defense of the West, and a lot of these people have a very apocalyptic vision. I mean, if you get into the really sort of nasty end of it, the sort of things that the Christchurch mass murderer was interested in. You get a lot of references to the gates of Vienna and the battle against the Ottoman Turks in the 17th century, and this sense of a sort of civilizational collapse. I mean, it's very melancholy in a way. I mean, they're simultaneously saying we're the greatest and the best, and we deserve to be on top, and it's our natural destiny, and oh no, we're at the end, these are the end times, these are the last days of civilization, and we're just a few civilized people in our tower as the brown hordes come. I mean, it's a completely incoherent notion in one way, and it depends on this sort of essentialist idea that only the bearers of the blood are the bearers of that civilization. Somebody like me, if I come along and I read Goethe, it doesn't count. So it's a very kind of peculiar notion, and that's where sort of Bannon kind of is further away from someone like Thiel. I mean, Peter Thiel is an interesting figure as a very sort of pure libertarian. I mean, he seems to want to kind of cut the guy ropes and float off into space. Him and his buddy Patry Friedman, this guy who set up, wants to set up the idea of seasteading, literal communities in international waters, free of national law. And there's a kind of there's a politics around, a libertarian politics around, which imagines a sort of pure political organization based around the idea of exit, the idea that you ought to be in a kind of contractual relationship with any sort of politics, any kind of organization that you're part of, and that if you don't like it, you should be able in a very friction-free way to leave. And so there's quite a kind of elaborated idea of this, that big formations like America or the EU should be broken down into what they call a patchwork, a much more of kind of micro states and micro organizations which will compete in this sort of market-like way to attract talent, and the talent then signs on in a kind of binding way to whatever the terms and conditions of the particular micro state are. And if you want to break your contract, you have to leave. But if you're going to stay part of it, there's no notion of sort of lobbying or kind of the public square or anything like that. It's very axiomatic. You can see how it kind of appeals to
selfish people.
Well, but this is the sort of Ayn Rand idea of selfishness is rational. Like what's irrational? Altruism is foolishness. And it purports to be very realistic, because it's it says, well, if everybody acts in their own self-interest, then they'll take whatever sort of rational calculations they need to take in order to maximize that self-interest, and you create a structure where the best version of how to run things wins. I mean, it's a politics that seems to me to not survive contact with the real world at all, and to sort of exist in its pure form purely as a sort of digital creature. It's this is what I was saying about it's attractive to software engineers who like to think in terms of sort of flowcharts and and or XOR kind of decision trees, but it absolutely rejects the mechanisms of democracy and the kind of messy cultural grey areas in which for good or ill we actually do exist as political actors. But it is another kind of utopianism, this sort of pure libertarian utopianism. It's different from Steve Bannon's sort of ethno-state, but it's and there are various other people on the right who have kind of traditionalist Catholic notions of ending the separation of church and state, and you have this kind of integralist idea of building the city of God, according to I don't know. I mean, there's a weird kind of route that some of these guys go down as ending up as Orthodox Christians. I think it's because the most sort of elaborate kind of traditional submission to the will of God is attractive. In fact, some of the Nazis end up as Muslims, which is a very weird, very minor kind of pathway. But some of the very extreme fascists have kind of flipped the switch and ended up as Islamic fundamentalists.
No kidding.
For sure. There's a guy in Britain who was infamous as the sort of founder of one of the most violent. It's a terrorist organization basically called Combat 18. That was a Nazi terrorist organization, and he renamed himself Ibn something or other, and was sort of photographed with his prayer beads and a long beard and justifying 9/11. I mean, there's a sort of there's a transgressive impulse that drives some of these guys. There's a sort of absolutist impulse that drives some of them. I think that's very different from the sort of kind of techno-rational kind of libertarian thing, but they intersect in very strange ways in some of these online spaces, and the kind of extreme right is a funny sort of mixture of these different constituencies.
Yeah, that is funny. You know, it's just interesting to stop and think about the complexity of it, because it can be easy to oversimplify and imagine it's just this massive horde of like white supremacists, but everybody's coming to it with all these intersecting agendas. And where I always fall, and I'm no master of this subject matter, but to me it's like, it seems pretty obvious that we're all in this together. Like we're all interconnected and that we're all interdependent. And that does not discount the importance of individual liberty, but you have to sort of come to a place of sane equilibrium between those two, the tension there. Like, am I crazy? Like, why is this so hard?
I think the pandemic has really shown us the limits of this kind of hyper, call it neoliberal view of the world, which, in a sense, liberalism is very good at the individual and very bad at understanding the group. Because, when we know the bias is always towards individual rights and freedom from coercion by a group. But what happens when public health, for example, depends on shows how interdependent we are? Networks of mutual aid need to be in existence in order to help people survive certain things. So there's a real challenge to a kind of hyper individualism that the pandemic has brought forward, and I would say that it is one reason why the US and Britain has fared quite badly, is because the kind of political instincts of the people in charge aren't to justify not just sacrifice but just kind of mutual care. An ethics of care is a very interesting thing to think about right now. And you're right in the. I think a lot of let's say that the tech industry and skews youngish, male-ish, and whitish, and
incel-ish.
but these sort of young guys are feel they're pretty invulnerable, don't like being told what to do, and imagine freedom is definitely freedom from some sort of, from mum, from some sort of, larger coercive force. And I can see why a politics which just, which allows you to justify why you shouldn't have to bother about people who, the weak, the halt, and the lame, is attractive in that way. And the idea of a kind of, self-optimization is a big thing.
Biohacking.
Yeah, and even in sort of less extreme ways than that, productivity. I'm very interested in the kind of ideology of productivity, in the way that we're supposed to just be making ourselves better, which obviously begs the question is, better for what, or for whom, or to do what, and it is, it's the idea of the sort of pushing the idea that the human community is a limit that you need to transcend, rather than something that you should, that you can have benefits and joy participating in. That's a strong tension in our culture at the moment. The idea of kind of breaking free and going off to Mars in your sort of libertarian space colony is a kind of just sort of a more extreme version of the ideology of sort of dieting and going to the gym to make yourself like just slightly better than the next person with whom you're in competition.
Yeah, I feel like there are among the technology class or the technocrats, you have these like high priests of self-optimization. A lot of them have podcasts, and they write books, and like and it's mostly male. It's all these guys like vying to sort of like reduce their body fat to 3%, and increase their cognition and get an edge. Basically, it's like the rat race on steroids. It seems to me, and I find myself only able to tolerate engaging with it for like a few minutes before I get exhausted. I'm just like, ugh. Like, if this is the way things are going, like, we're in trouble.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, rest and relaxation, and very culturally underrated right now. I mean, my question is, who are you optimizing for? I mean, maybe you feel it's better for you to live longer or to live more healthily, and that's completely fine. But a lot of it seems to me is sort of internalization of an ideology that really benefits your employer rather than you. If you're vying with everybody else at your level in big corp, whatever it would be, to who can. I mean, like years ago, I mean, my first proper job was at a magazine called Wired. In the mid 90s, you must know it, which had this, it's a tech magazine that at the time was this sort of, it's the tip of the spear of that kind of West Coast libertarian culture. And I remember I arrived there, and somebody says to me, if you're not prepared to sleep in the crawl space of your desk, you clearly don't enjoy your job enough. And I'm like, it had never occurred to me to want to sleep in the crawl space of my desk,
right?
And, I learned a great deal from that job, and about the things that it was permissible to kind of imagine for a technological future, and the things that it wasn't. I made some good friends there, and it was in some ways a kind of great place, but it was also a place where I was very much against the grain of a particular sort of techno-utopianism that later on I kind of pieced together what I'd as an early 20-something in London as well. I'd kind of come into contact with something that has metastasized into being such a sort of major part of our culture now. And yeah, it's the founder of Wired turned out to be somebody who had sued Berkeley back in the late 60s or early 70s for interrupting his education by allowing Vietnam protests on campus. He was that guy.
Really? Interesting. What's his name? I should know that.
A guy called Louis Rosetto.
Okay.
And he was he was an absolute straight up libertarian, and I mean, it was very alien to me as a sort of London boy at that time to come into contact with that. He was absolutely about get rid of the government, transcend all human limits. I met people who were, they used to call themselves extropians. I don't know if extropians really exist anymore, but they were all about life extension and biohacking and smart drugs and the whole kind of thing. And it was all about, the human is a sort of horizon which we must transcend.
What and like all these, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, like they all want to go to space and they all want to go to Mars. I look at Mars and I'm like, I have like less than zero interest in going to that place. It looks like hell. I'm like, what? What is the allure?
It looks like the kind of the sort of in between bits of Nevada.
Yeah,
I mean it's
and it's freezing. It's like 70 degrees below zero. Like, what are people thinking?
I mean, I feel like it's the it's the beyond, isn't it? I mean, there's a conversation to be had about the special place of the frontier in American cultural thinking, and what happened when the railways finally joined up and there was no place to go. It was the high frontier of the space race, and I think there's a generational thing in that. I think those dudes like Musk and Bezos were kids who grew up. I mean, as I did. I mean, I remember the sort of ray gun type science fiction story where you were jetting off into an exciting future, and I mean, I think the fact that they're so wealthy that they can afford to put their childhood dreams into practice is I suppose. I don't know what it is, but I think that's where it comes from. I don't know why Bezos has a rocket. He knows, he seems to me like a guy who'd probably be happier by the pool. I mean, Musk clearly has to have a rocket. I mean, Musk stuck his Tesla into orbit around Mars, didn't he?
I mean, like, Bezos, talk about like biohacking. Like the guy was like a schlubby nerd in the beginning, and now he looks like Lex Luthor with like, a steroid habit. Like, I look at somebody with that much wealth and I'm thinking, why can't he be like his ex-wife and like try to help people that are here? He's trying to go to Mars. Like, if you want to explore space, that's great. I'm not anti-exploring Mars, but this idea that we're going to create a massive human colony there in an environment that harsh and unforgiving and without water, I mean, maybe some people would enjoy it.
Well,
but
it suggests that you want to trash this planet, doesn't it? I mean, it's kind of worrying. If you're thinking that looks like a good option, then you must really be intending to kind of use the facilities here until they're worn out.
Right. So I want to, now that we've talked a lot about like the libertarian and like the alt-right, another aspect of your book, and correct me if I'm misapprehending it, but like you do offer a critique of, the left, at least to some degree, in the section of your book that takes us sort of out of the narrator's narrative and into the narrative of Monica, which is a really arresting section. It's like a hard turn in the book that I didn't see coming. And I should say too, like I think like as a general rule, and certainly with your book, I try to like read nothing about the book before reading it, including the flap copy. Like I barely even want to look at the title. You know what I'm saying? I just like to go in and just see what happens. And so I didn't see.
Me too. I like to take things on their own terms, and it's much the best way, I think.
Yeah. So like I was just like delightfully like, whoa, where is this going? And then, at least for me as a reader, it spoke to my own skittishness that can sometimes arise when I observe the political left in this country. Can you talk a little bit about your sense of how things function and kind of dovetail in our political spectrum?
I mean, the Monica story is the story of which is like a sort of like a wedge into a book that's otherwise very occupied with the experience of the narrator. I mean, Monica is somebody who grows up in 80s East Germany and is a sort of rebellious punk kid, and she's basically systematically destroyed by the Stasi, and her experience is very, it was something that I researched quite heavily, because one of the starting points of my thoughts about the book was about privacy and about the sense of needing a private space of selfhood, free of judgment and free of surveillance, in order a sort of scratch pad or just a place of experimentation where before you go out in public, so to speak, with your presentation of yourself or your ideas, there has to be some area where you can kind of work things out, and you should have the choice when to present yourself in public. I mean, one of the sort of the horrors of totalitarianism is this kind of the notion of the engineer of human souls, or the idea of a kind of state that wishes to have access to that inner life and to control what's thinkable rather than just how people behave or what they say in public. And I mean, when I got to Berlin, I did do a residency in Berlin, and I sort of stole the physical location of that residency for the novel and put a different institution into the building. And when I got there, I knew I wanted to write something about that part of Berlin's history, which was to do with the sort of the surveillance state. And I imagined that I would be probably talking about dissidents or political dissidents or intellectuals. And what I discovered was that they had spent a huge amount of resources on teenage punks. They were convinced that punk was a kind of Western-backed plot to subvert the morals of East German youth. And so, I mean, and the Stasi operated in a very it's kind of a beggar's belief, really. The resources that they would put into kind of surveilling people, and they wouldn't just watch people; they would actively. There was something called Zersetzung, or corrosion or undermining, which was a set of psychological techniques that they were taught at a Stasi university in Potsdam, which was about sort of the demolition of the personalities of the people who were their targets. It was making people's friendships impossible, making people psychologically are uncomfortable. It was about invading their personal space in a very literal way. Often they just let themselves into people's apartments and just sort of mess with stuff. They'd change things around. They'd kind of break small items, or they'd leave your photographs out on the bed or something like that. And the rights critique of the left in general is that it's it wishes to make a new human in order to kind of fulfill the utopian notion of a good society, whatever that is, and that in some way leftist ideas will always tend towards this kind of controlling and this kind of invasiveness into the subjectivity of people. I actually think that there's a kind of I identify as a man of the left, and I think there's a much more kind of pragmatic version of left politics that doesn't require you to kind of tinker with people in that way in order to fit them better to the utopian society that you're trying to make. I think there are many very sort of pragmatic and nailed down reasons for, as we've been talking about, care and community and mutual aid and interdependence, these kind of thoughts. My read of the current sort of situation in the US is that by and large, I think the whole cancel culture thing is wildly overblown for political ends, because it's the idea of the you can't speak out of line, or the idea of cancellation is this kind of disappearance. It's a sort of it has these overtones of Stalinism and the erasure of Trotsky in the photographs next to Stalin. The idea about wrong think and so on. And there are complicated reasons, I think, why that politics has come about, and some of it is a kind of very defensive politics, because I think certainly in I don't know. I was around for a previous round of the culture wars as an undergraduate in the late 80s. There were fights about so-called political correctness and that kind of thing, and fights about language, and fights about there's a sort of my sense of things is that we could all use exactly the right words and be terribly civil to each other, and nothing would structurally be changed about the situation at all. That fighting about language is in some ways a kind of red herring, and what you're trying to change is to change who has money and power, how that's distributed in society. But I think there are clearly situations where, especially when you get into the rather sort of, I would say, the sort of liberal inflected diversity politics, which considers everything as a sort of personal sin or a personal job to reconstruct yourself to be, not racist or whatever it is. That's a kind of, that's an ask that's impossible to fulfill in a society where structurally there are things that are not in your control. The question is actually much harder than getting people to examine their own motivations for things and try and be better. I don't think that's a bad thing to do. I think that's a reasonable thing to do. But it's often kind of presented in this kind of, you've got to reprogram yourself or face oblivion.
One of the things I want to compliment you on is how beautifully you portrayed how the Stasi develops an asset and breaks a person down. I think I have maybe a heightened fascination about that because of the strange dealings between Russia and the United States in the last administration, all this talk of assets and how, certain power figures in the American political class might get co-opted by a foreign adversary, for example. But as an extension of that kind of behavior and those kinds of relationships, I was thinking about what you were saying about the Stasi and how they mess with people. And then I was projecting that into digital culture. And it's like, you think about you being online in the early aughts looking at 4chan with like some curiosity and fascination and kind of like creeping horror. And then you think about bad actors all over the globe, whether it's at home or abroad, looking at the advent of social media, which was really around 2005. It was that same time, when Facebook launched, and how the lessons learned in a pre-digital military and intelligence class could be overlaid onto digital culture. And I think that's what we've seen, is it not?
I think that's true. I mean, certainly in terms of if you think about censorship and about how information flows around. I mean, back in the the utopian 90s days of Wired, the idea that information wanted to be free was a kind of belief that in some way the internet was going to transcend certain sorts of borders and national boundaries, and that was going to be unmitigatedly a good thing. It was going to make certain traditional censorship impossible. What it's turned out to be the case is that you can't necessarily prevent people from getting hold of information, unless you have an infrastructure like China perhaps is putting into place. But you can make it impossible for people to discern the truth from lies. To Bannon's famous phrase about flooding the zone with shit. Like when you want to kind of discredit a voice on the internet, you can't kind of switch them off necessarily, but you can create many sort of subtle refractions and opposition, and have 20 other people shouting in this, about the same thing in slightly different ways, and thus basically make the cost of discerning the truth too high for the normal person to bother going into. You think about all the Russia-related stuff, and during the kind of Mueller inquiry period of the Trump administration, every single fact was disputed, every single event was disputed. You couldn't kind of make a quick kind of study to decide for yourself what you thought was going on, because the cacophony of voices made that impossible. And again, without getting conspiratorial about it, that is an old technique of intelligence services. They know how to discredit a truth teller. It's by kind of admit nothing, deny everything, make counter accusations. That's the old that's what you're taught at spy school. And we've seen that become a kind of standard political technique. I mean, that's every time anybody asserts anything, there's a kind of bald assertion of the opposite, no matter how ridiculous that might be on its face. So we're in a situation where we're overloaded with information at all times, and it's very, very hard for the average person who hasn't got time or energy or skills to discern the truth to actually do that. So the result is a kind of massive loss of trust, and people feel that they're at sea in a world of competing opinions. And I've watched friends and acquaintances fall down conspiracy rabbit holes because they don't have a hierarchy anymore of what seems plausible and what doesn't. And that that's another part of Red Pill and the kind of atmosphere I wanted to portray in the novel is that feeling of being at sea in a world of connections.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think about QAnon being one of the more prominent examples of that, and I think about the things that I was talking about with regard to the Stasi and the melding of digital culture with older spy school techniques. Like, I can't help but wonder, like, who the hell is behind all that, and to what end? Is it just some sort of dude in his basement, who spends a lot of time on forums and got some traction with this meme and just was having fun with it, and it got out of control? I mean, there's some good investigation that's been done on that, and an interest and in classic kind of 4chan 8chan fashion. It's something that started out as a joke that then became serious. Like, there was a fashion on 4chan and 8chan before all this took off for posting as if you were an insider, like for basically writing a little piece of a flash fiction in the voice of I'm embedded in a place under the White House, and I'm going to tell you the secret truth, and that kind of everybody likes that stuff in a kind of spy school kind of way, and
then somebody, and the guy who eventually started, or the account that started posting as Q, had a few goes at doing that before anybody paid any attention. There are Q drops from like several months before the first sort of one that got traction, where they were just kind of making a bunch of assertions about all this kind of, you know, Trump as this secret superhero who's going to take down the child traffickers and bring in, you know, good times for all. And then it did get picked up. And then there's this sort of layer of, you know, is it ironic? Is it serious? Is it fiction? Is it fact? But it's fun to promote. So it got taken off. And then what happened that I think people couldn't have predicted was it leapt over the sort of species barrier between the denizens of the Chans into the kind of suburban world of the Trumpy soccer mom. And Q became, as we now know, this sort of huge cultural phenomenon. And from what I understand, the account maybe belonged to somebody and was then stolen by somebody else, possibly a man called Jim Watkins, who's the owner of 8chan, who then, you know, there's a point where the drops change very much in tone. And anyways, but it's almost like regardless of who's doing it at that point, the fact that there were these supposed voices of secret truth coming out, that everybody could, you know, when there was a new drop, the Q groups would kind of gather on people's YouTube live streams or whatever and dissect it, and on all the kind of, almost all the kind of traditional, slightly sort of marginal, like numerology and the sort of things that people do with Bible verses and stuff. You know, people use the same techniques to analyze that, and they got a real sense of community out of it, and it became this massive thing. And now, you know, you look at how it kind of headed off into Instagram influencer culture. There's a very weird zone of sort of yoga / Q now. I mean, that the Q shaman guy is very much part of that. So I mean, a lot of people who would be worried about chemtrails or, you know, putting bad things into their body or you know, not being told the truth about some other thing were very receptive, as it turned out, to this political story that Q was telling. I mean, the whole thing's falling apart now because there are no more Q drops, and it's kind of fading into a sort of more general kind of anxious paranoia. It hasn't got the kind of narrative focus of the imminent arrest of the Democrats and the storm and all that kind of thing. But you know, none of the conditions that made it possible have gone away.
Well, yeah, I mean, and it's like, I think there's a part of me as somebody who's an outside observer and like many arms lengths away. I read about QAnon, especially in the last like quarter of the Trump administration as it really started to gain traction. I would read an article about it here and there, but I never like went and observed it, or I just didn't have time to engage. And yet when I'm thinking about how much traction it has among a certain faction of the population, and how we now have like QAnon congresswomen actually in our leadership structure, it would make somebody like me wonder if the person behind it is operating with like a level of sophistication that, say, an intelligence operative would have. That's at least, like, I think that's kind of a logical idea. Like, wow, is somebody pulling the strings back there who really knows how to manipulate people?
You know, I don't know whether that's necessary for that to happen. I mean, this is the fascinating thing about, you know, internet storms of one or another. I mean, the kind of, you know, the power and reach of Q is incredible. So it was natural to assume that there must be a guiding, you know, you'd have to be smart in order to put that together. But I think so often it's just a kind of almost like a kind of economy of scale, and everybody kind of contribute. It's like Wikipedia. It's like a kind of Wikipedia of disinformation, Q.
Right.
At this point, it's now a kind of nexus of all sorts of conspiracy thinking, a lot of which predates Q by hundreds of years. I mean, the Illuminati story, all the kind of, you know, all the anti-Semitic kind of bankers in Zurich stuff that's involved, chemtrails, it's like a kind of clearinghouse of, you know, of all this stuff, and that, you know, and people stitch them together in, you know, if you Google the Q map, there's a wonderful sort of wigged out supposed diagram of everything involved in Q. I mean, Atlantis is in there. You know, it's
they've left nothing to chance. We've got everything.
So yeah, I mean, I think kind of if you're a bad actor of some kind, you can use this to kind of create chaos and then take advantage of the chaos. But I don't think it doesn't need a guiding hand in order to happen.
Well, your book is not about QAnon, but in some ways it might as well be. I kind of think of like the old iceberg theory, like you have the novel Red Pill is above the surface, and then there's all this stuff, that I feel like you have been considering, like I've been considering, at least to some degree, and you've rendered a fiction that it's just deeply intelligent. It has a historical lens, it has a literary and philosophical lens, it obviously has a political lens. The fact that it's set in Germany, or largely set in Germany, there's so many different layers that like I'm still kind of sorting out my feelings on it, and I feel like I need to do additional reading to kind of put it all together, and that's a credit to you. I'm trying to compliment you.
Thank you. So much.
It's a book that's like smarter than I am, and I always appreciate that. And it also solves, it solves the problem of like how to respond to what we've just lived through in fiction in an effective way. And I think that's been the concern of a lot of novelists. And just like credit to you for being able to do it in such quick, such a rapid fire. It's like a rapid response to what we just went through, but in a way that feels measured. And I think knowing what I know about you now, the fact that you were on 4chan back in the early aughts, like no wonder you're the person to be able to do this.
It turns, even the kind of weirdest distractions turn out to be useful eventually.
Well, but I think too, like some people, I think writers in general have good antenna. You're picking up signals maybe that most people either don't have the time or the ability to pick up. And you just, you're out there with a good antenna and you're picking up signals, and we're lucky to have somebody who's able to kind of process things for us in this way. I don't know. There's a sense of gratitude that I have. It's like, okay, thank God somebody's out there standing on the wall watching this stuff. And
that's a wonderful compliment. Thank you so much.
Well, I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed our time talking. I guess like maybe a way to close would be twofold. First of all, you said this earlier. You don't know how things are going to go. Like we haven't reached any kind of like celebratory finish line with the dismissal of Trump. Like, do you have a sense of where things are headed? Like, what are you concerned about today, and where do you feel good? Like, what's your general take on how we need to go from here?
Wow, I wish I had the answer. I'd be kind of saying, pointing this way, follow me. I mean, I think, I think we certainly need to focus on the kind of material conditions of people in the wake of the pandemic. I think the pandemic has exposed a great deal of very rickety infrastructure in various ways, kind of, physical infrastructure, organizational infrastructure, and in a way, kind of cultural infrastructure. A lot of the things that we thought we had backstopped, we don't have backstopped. And I think we need to build resilience, and that's going to require quite a lot of listening to people who are very different from ourselves, and it's going to have to require a great deal of cooperation. So I mean, I think that's if there's a tendency I would like to encourage, it would be toward building that resiliency.
And then what about next book? Have you started something new, or are you just taking a break after this one?
I have, yeah, and I mean, there's the idea is to kind of complete a very loose trilogy. The novel before Red Pill is called White Tears, and this next one is called Blue Ruin. That old phrase, which was a nickname for gin, in fact, but Blue Ruin is I'm not going to say anything about it in plot terms, but it has some sort of family resemblance to the other two books, and it has, inevitably, because of when I'm writing it, has the same sort of anxious undertow to it as well.
Yeah, well, again, it's making me think of I think it's Krzysztof Kieslowski. Didn't he have? He had the red, white, and blue films of back in
3 colors.
Yeah. So it's kind of maybe it's a nod to that, or just like a coincidence.
Yeah. Well, everything's connected.
Right. That's my conspiracy theory. We'll end it there. Hari Kunzru is somehow connected to Krzysztof Kieslowski.
All right. Thanks, Brad. Really nice to talk to you.
Okay, you guys, there you go. That is Hari Kunzru. His latest novel, Red Pill, is available now from Knopf. Go get your copy. It's a wonderful book. You can find Hari online at harikunzru.com. You can also track him down on Twitter. His handle over there is @HariKunzru. Hari Kunzru is also a podcaster, I should mention. His show is called Into the Zone. It's available from Pushkin Industries. It's all about binary oppositions and how borders are never as clear as we think. Again, the name of the show is Into the Zone. And the novel, one more time, is called Red Pill. Go get it immediately. This program is available free of charge. It's offered freely. It's a listener-supported show. If you like it, if you listen regularly and you have the means, support it. Tip your server. You can do so for as little as $1 a month over at patreon.com/otherpplpod. That's patreon.com/otherpplpod. You can get all sorts of gear. There are prizes. I'll write you a postcard. I'll wish you happy birthday. Patreon.com/otherpplpod. If you would like to write to me, the show's email address is letters@otherppl.com. Don't forget this program has its own official app, the Other People with Brad Listi app. It's free. Go get it wherever you get your apps. Next week on the program, it's a bit of a TBD. I think it's going to be Gina Frangello for my 700th podcast episode. Gina's an old pal. She wrote a book called Blow Your House Down that is just a whale of a book. That's how I describe it. It's a whale of a book. It's a monster. So stay tuned for that. 700 episodes. What do you think? If for some reason it's not Gina, it'll be somebody else. I always podcast on time. It's the best I can say about myself.